Today, I wanted to. I guess I've invented a series here for us, going over the radically collaborative patterns for software makers. Software makers. I was thinking I might talk about some other thing, but I'm going to go over this today. Now, I think there's a section in here that I think is particularly interesting that I thought would be nice to go over, and that is test-driven development. Something that is not done, as I'll show you, as much as you might think. But, I don't want to give away. You can go get this book for free easily. If you go to the show notes at cote.io/Tanzu Talk, you can find it. Or if I've done my job properly, there should be a little eye up here you can click on to go download it. And I'll put a link at the end of the video as well if you want to download the book for free. Anyhow, this is an important concept that, until I started thinking about, Pivotal Labs Think More and kind of started talking with large organizations trying to do application modernization, I didn't really, value the frequency of talking about it as much as I do nowadays. That's because I sort of would assume that that people would be doing this. But so first, let me tell you what test-driven development is, or TDD, which I'm going to try to avoid saying because that sounds funny. And, I'm totally serious on these. But the idea is that before you write code, you first write a test. And the other important aspect of that that's just worth knowing for your mental thing is you write the test so that it fails, right? Well, I shouldn't say you write the test so that it fails, but you write the test that would run your code. And before you run the code, when you run the test, it should fail. Now, why is this? Because you haven't written the code that does the right thing yet. So the initial time you run your test in your test-driven development, it should always fail. I think that's right, if I remember. Now, there's a variant of test-driven development called unit testing. I mean, it's a subsection of test-driven development, I would almost say, where you find each method in your code and you write a test for it following the test-driven development pattern. And, you can follow that per a method level or a class level or whatever. But unit testing, I guess you wouldn't call it a subset, it's overlapping. Unit testing can also be done in a non-test-driven development way where you write the unit tests afterwards, right? You write your code and you write a unit test for a method out of a given string, get a date, right? Or pass in a date, run this thing that puts the date in a standard format, right? So if you weren't doing test-driven development, but you were doing unit testing, you would write the code first, and then you would write the unit test. And unit tests are nice, right? They tell you if you have testing for code coverage. And the whole point of having these tests is not only to test out the initial goodness of something, right, that your code works, but the important thing, what we are really interested in here, is that it allows you to have confidence, as they say, in changing the code. So if you want to change how the code works, your chief problem that you learn becomes knowing that your changes don't mess things up, that you don't introduce bugs by writing code in a new way. So you need to have extensive test suites if you're going to go through and refactor, rewrite, or otherwise modernize your software, right? And there's, as always cited, it's almost like a required part of the ritual to cite the Michael Feathers book, Legacy Code something or another. I forget what it's called. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, but I think it's like working with legacy code. And the premise of that book starts off with the idea, a definition of legacy code. Legacy code is code that doesn't have tests. Why is that? Because, as I like to joke, no one calls code that they're looking forward to changing, that they're working on legacy code. You only call it legacy code if you fear changing it, you don't want to change it. Legacy code's kind of like a negative sort of thing. And usually, if you had tests for your code, you could change it with confidence, know that everything was cool. But oftentimes with legacy code and systems, you don't really have effective test coverage. So this, in fact, arguably, is not the only source of what legacy is and technical debt, if you will, things that slow down development. But it's a huge cause of it, right? It's a huge reason that you have, as you can see in these curves here, that you have the slowdown effect of untested, or rather, or legacy code as it's called. And you'll see what I did here. The reason is to use a diagram here, right? Like it's really fast. Let me turn this stuff on so you can see my amazing integration. I'll use red because that will be like so much better, right? So, how come I can't get rid of those? Whatever. So what happens if you're not doing tests, right? Initially, you're going to be able to move really fast, right? So because you're not slowed down by having to write tests first, right? So you're kind of doubling, if not sometimes more. It can be hard to test code, but you're spending a lot of time writing test code initially. So you're going to be able to do things faster because you have more time to write your regular code. But what happens right here? How come my pencil's not working? I can't amaze you. What happens right here is that you've gotten to the point where you've got a lot of code. You don't have confidence because you haven't written tests. And now you're slowed down because you can't, in a safe way, add new code and modify other code. So you slow down until, as often organizations I talk to, you get to this point where you've got so much legacy code, so much untested code, and other things that make it hard to change, that things come screeching to a halt, right? Just to add one feature takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. So this, kind of avoiding this curve, is a lot of what you're going for. Again, in addition to other things, when you're doing test-driven development, when you're making sure your code is testable. And instead, of course, you want this. This is the good outcome over here, right? Because your speed at getting features out, and speed is whatever. Here, speed means I would take to mean delivering features to production, right? Not just speed of coding because you type fast or whatever. But it's going to take a lot longer at first, right? Because you got to write all these tests and do things like that. But eventually, and this graph is a little weird because is this axis constant? Anyways, I never trust a smooth graph other than to like illustrate a point, and I've just demonstrated why. Is I think there's something a little wacky here, but it does illustrate the point being made. It's not like, smooth graphs, always untrustworthy. But what you see is that you actually are able to deploy more and more code, and it'll plateau off at a good rate here, kind of being responsible to use another concept illustrated in this book well, when you figure out your velocity. But you are, instead of like your speed kind of dropping like we see over here, right? Instead, because you have confidence, because you have tests, you can do more and more releases, right? And you can kind of maintain the speed. You don't get bogged down because you're throttled by the lack of tests that you have, right? And again, why do you get throttled? Because you're trying to change you're trying to change your code, add new features, and you need to be able to run tests to make sure you haven't introduced a book. And look, I'll be the cool person who interacts with the stream. The book is called Radically Collaborative Patterns for Software Makers, which you can get a copy of it for free if you go to cote.io/Tanzu Talk, and just pick the most recent show there, and there'll be a link to how you can get a hold of it for free. So there you go. Look, I'm a streamer or something. So with that understanding of why it's valuable to have test-driven development and to kind of put up with the annoyance of doing it, let's dive just a little bit into some kind of why you should care about it. Another reason. So the first reason is that if you look at this graph, right, you're not going to get trapped in the bad state where you were able to release a bunch of code at once, but now you need to add new features and modify things down to the lines of code to actual architectures, but you can't really test things reliably, so it takes you a long time to build up confidence to release. You might have to retroactively, you might have to put more testing in, or you got to do a lot of manual testing, but it's going to be slow if you can't test your code. That's the summary. Whereas if you've taken the time up front, in this model, yay, look at this person. Now they've got hair, maybe even some big ears. Let's see. We'll make them a atypical developer and have them have a tie on, maybe even a collared shirt. Give them a little bit of cheeks there. You got to have a nose, right? So you're that guy. You're that person, I should say. You're much happier because you spent the time up front to do tests, and now you have confidence to change your code around. So I want to go over, like I said, I didn't really start thinking about this and mentioning it frequently until I started talking more frequently with large organizations who want to do things differently. Because when I was brought up, was brought up in software vendors programming, and we always did testing. I mean, to be fair, back in the late 90s when I started, this wasn't sort of the same idea it is nowadays. So we did do tests, but it wasn't quite as disciplined. But when I was doing my work in the, from 2000 to 2005, we were right in the heat of all of that. And so we did a lot of test-driven development. So I assumed every other developer was like that. But when you go talk outside of the tech world, and probably also in the tech world, to be fair, and I could probably look at the demographics of what I'm about to show you to figure this out. But what I've done here is let's get a sense of how many people do test-driven development. And what you find is that, I don't know, anywhere between, depending on the year, the survey, you've got somewhere between 30 and 40% of people who admit that they do test-driven development. Now, I'm no whiz at math, but what that means is that 70 to, like I said, I'm no whiz, but 60 to 70% of people do not do test-driven development, right? And so there's a lot of surveys. Gartner does a pretty good annual Agile survey. And as always, Gartner is very touchy and weird and annoying for someone like me who comes up with what they're going to talk about an hour before time to use their stuff. So instead, I've gone to I think it's equally better, if not equally better. It's equally good, if not better, because there are many year over year. There's about, I think, 10 years, if not more, of surveys from what used to be called version 1. And I think now they have some, I don't know, kind of weird name for a developer tool company, collab.ai or something like that. Good for them, right? But, they actually do have an interesting portfolio of stuff, kind of a bundling together of a bunch of developer tools. But for years, they've done the State of Agile report. And I took the, I spent some time a while ago downloading all 10, 12 years of it, and if you're really into charts and stuff, it's actually kind of entertaining to walk through them. Also, at a whole other meta layer, you can kind of go through 10 or 12 years of visual design stuff. You can see how the visual design they have changes over time. Anyways, so let's look at the last 5 years, right? Now, if I was super cool, I would have taken all of this information and put it into a chart, but you're going to instead get to go through looking at the charts themselves. So we see in 2019, right? So the one I have here, I have to go. It's a little annoying to use the pencil, but you can see that what we have there is you got 30% people saying they do test-driven development, right? We go to 2018, we got 33% saying they do test-driven development, 35% the next year, then you got 40%. Ooh, people were being very hygienic then. Or maybe those people who weren't doing it didn't show up because they were spending time writing tests instead of answering surveys. And then down here, in the last one, you got 33%. So again, sloppy philosophy degree holding person like me, I would call that 35%, but you can throw in whatever range you want. So the point of that, and this is a point I like to make when I'm talking with big groups of people, or small groups, if they haven't guided what I'm talking about, is that, and also you can look at the rest of these survey things, right? Like people will say that there's always, they got lots of certifications. They say they're doing Agile, but when you look at survey results year after year after year, I mean, they're pretty consistent. People don't actually follow all of the Agile techniques or use tools out there, right? I think this is something that, especially if you're in management and above, it's really important to kind of keep up with the benchmarks out there and realize that, sure, I'm sure you're special and you're doing everything perfectly, right? You've got unique requirements and everything's figured out. But at least when you talk with your peers, you can understand why they're so upset and things aren't working out well with them. And you could refer them to these charts as well. Because again, you're always, and as an individual, right, you're always going to be on the right side of this. Less flippantly, chances are in your organization, you're not doing as well as you could. Like if you remember my other concept, right? Doing something always works better than doing nothing. So it's good to go through and make sure that you're actually following Agile things. But to this point, there's a pretty high chance that in your organization, again, if you're a manager, if you or an executive, if you look over all your development teams, there's a great chance that they're not doing test-driven development. It's highly likely, and especially the larger the organization, maybe there's probably patchwork of people doing it. So getting to that point where you actually are doing test-driven development is, incredibly important, right? Let me open this back up. Because again, you want to be that happy dude with the tie. And it's written up pretty well in this book. It doesn't necessarily go over the techniques, but I think, well, it kind of does. But I think with a lot of the writing in this book, what's nice about it is there's this funny chart here. But it kind of lays out the case for doing it and why you would want to do it. And then it also kind of, there's a section that I like that sort of says, these are the attributes that you should have when you're doing test-driven development, right? This is what it should look like when you're doing this stuff. Again, if you remember from yesterday, if you don't measure things, you don't know if it's going well. And it's a qualitative measurement instead of a quantitative one. But it kind of goes over some guidance of what things should look like when you're doing it. And there's a little bit of thought put into how much time are you going to spend on testing versus doing other things. And I think I forget if I highlighted it here, but I think there is a point that is worth thinking a lot about, especially when I read this, because I used to do things, come across this, and that is like, it's hold on, let me do my magic of, I'm more just impressing myself here. Anyways, in order to do speed, you often end up doing this thing called mocking, which is like you don't use the actual code that will be used in production. This is often done with your data sources like databases and more complicated workflow processes. And mocking is good because it'll speed things up and you don't have to spin up your entire infrastructure to test things out. But it can sort of like mess up your test because what's the substitute, the simulation of the services you're using could be too good and won't really simulate reality. So it's better than nothing. But you always have to be careful when you're mocking things out. Now, one of the things that I think makes cloud native development or developing on cloud infrastructure really nice is it should be pretty easy to get a really good duplication of production in the cloud environment that you have. It's not like the old days when I would do development where like literally, because we didn't have like cloud stuff, like setting up a development lab often meant whenever you found a computer that no one else was using, you would take it and stick it under your desk so that you could create a development lab to simulate what production looked like. I don't know why it was so hard. I mean, it's short-sightedness. And also stuff was more expensive back then. But if you have more of a cloud infrastructure, if you've built out a private one, if you're doing it right, where you have infinite capacity, but you have more capacity than you're not limiting it. This reminds me of a little, I don't know if this would count as a Zen koan, but in the stories I tell my kids, I've introduced sort of like a kid's version of the Necronomicon. And I also at some point introduced the Nietzschean eternal reoccurrence thing. And then also I've mixed that in with the comic book idea of like infinite dimensions and worlds. And so I'm always trying to come up with like little paradoxes for them, which is like, if you are a finite being, and sort of, you have a finite life and sort of perception, there's only so much you can't sort of like perceive infinite things. Then can you ever really perceive if something is infinite or not? Because if this total sum of perceptions or matter is infinity minus 1, therefore it's finite, but I can only ever detect infinity minus 5, then I'll never really know if it's infinite or finite. And so effectively it is infinite. So like, is anything really ever infinite? No one really knows, right? I think if you haven't looked up the eternal reoccurrence thing, that's a fun one to like screw around in your head with. I think as always, there's some discussion they have in the Avengers movies between the Back to the Future view of time travel versus like the Avengers view of time travel. And I think there's some answer, some footnotes to eternal reoccurrence in there. Anyways, what was I talking about? That's right. So if you have a cloud and you have this like infinite or finite set of infrastructure, you should be able to pretty easily replicate what production looks like, seeding it with data, but more importantly, replicate what the configuration and the exact topology, what it looks like when you're running your code in production, and have a better idea, have more quality to the testing that you're doing, as opposed to back in my day when you'd have to like mock out everything because you couldn't get a replication, you couldn't get a copy of production there. So anyhow, test-driven development, you should really look into that, because it's going to help you out. Like if you're, I could find some other survey stuff that shows, the number one or number two or number three thing. The number one thing holding back any change in any corporation for anything is always budget, which is probably true most of the time, but probably also means that people haven't, the executives answering this question haven't really found the exact way, the exact best, cheapest way of doing it. Instead, they kind of want to throw money at it, right? Like, for example, we have a skills gap. We can't hire the people that we need because we can't pay them what they need because we can't get enough budget. Whereas, like, really, what maybe they should do, especially if it involves Kubernetes, is you could go to kube.academy. And there's a tremendous amount of free training that you can do without even having to sign up for it. But with your existing staff or your existing self, you can go there and learn all about what Kubernetes is, how to manage it, how to run it, how to kind of get it working with developers. It's great, especially if you kind of, wherever you're coming from. If you've never done traditional VMware management, or you're one of these younger people who's never dealt with that kind of stuff, or older people, I don't know. But you can go to kube.academy for a bunch of free training. Now, similarly, if you wanted to go, I'll show you. Let's go back to my screen thing here. If you wanted to go to a place like, let's call it, if you're a developer type, hopefully there's nothing embarrassing in my web browser. We'll see. Oh, I'll get a fresh one. Let me come over here to get a fresh window. Look at that big blank screen that I got going on there. So you can also, if you go to tanzu.vmware, let's see, /developer, we have all sorts of free topics for the software developer and you out there. You can see you can explore that, also free. Hopefully my little thing will show up here, and more to come, as it were. And then also, if you're interested in diving into this more with people, it's a weird metaphor, diving into it. But if you go to cote.pizza, not only can you get a couple of my books for free, but you can find this software development office hours. And, I like to talk about how to improve the way you're doing software, all the way from the executive layer down to the software developer layer. And here you can actually try to schedule some time to talk with some of us. Obviously, we're going to try to sell you stuff eventually. We got this great funnel. We're not going to try to sell you stuff initially because we want to just see if it's a good match, see what you got going on. We don't want to scare you off by saying that we're going to sell stuff. But eventually, the whole reason we're doing it, one, because we're nice sometimes and fun with our time. But, of course, we want you to be a customer. But that said, if you do it right, you can hustle up some free consulting and kind of advice from us, and you might as well check it out. Why not? You can do a little session there. And then finally, if you're interested in finding that book for free, seeing past episodes that I've done here, talking about all sorts of topics, if you go to cote.io/tanzutalk, you can check out all the archives, and I'll use the one from yesterday. But if you want to get a copy of that book for free, you can just scroll down here, look, and there's a little link that you can go to. Or you can just wait for this video to end in a few seconds, and you can click on the book, and you'll go to where you can download it. And with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.